Scherbaffen, Manhattan, New York. The time was 2:47 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon, October 10th, 1964. That's when Mayme Johnson, age 58, along with her daughter Ruthie Johnson, who was 29, stepped through the gleaming brass and glass entrance of Bergmann Sterling. This exclusive Fifth Avenue boutique served Manhattan's most affluent families. Only recently had the establishment begun, with clear reluctance, to welcome black customers. For years, unwritten but rigidly enforced, whites-only rules had prevailed. Both women presented themselves impeccably. May wore a carefully tailored navy suit, complemented by pearl earrings and a matching necklace. Her leather handbag had a price tag exceeding what typical Harlem families brought home in 3 months. Ruthie looked equally refined in an elegant cream-colored dress paired with white gloves. Her hair was styled to perfection. She appeared just as sophisticated as the white society women who frequented this store regularly. They walked in quietly, maintaining their dignity. They browsed through displays featuring imported fabrics and designer clothing. Their movements showed the relaxed confidence of women accustomed to spending money, women who recognized quality when they encountered it. A sales clerk walked up to them. Multiple witnesses who were there that afternoon later confirmed this. The clerk asked politely whether she might assist them. May responded that they were searching for evening wear for an upcoming event. She would appreciate viewing the store's most exceptional selections. The clerk, a young white woman, seemed visibly nervous about serving black customers. Still, she made efforts to maintain professionalism. She started presenting them with various options from the fall collection. The visit proceeded for roughly 15 minutes without any major problems. May and Ruthie examined fabrics carefully. They inquired about prices. They discussed different styles and colors. Their voices carried culture and education. These were the voices of women who had shopped in fine establishments for years. Even if stores like Bergmann Sterling had only lately begun permitting their entry, several white customers glanced their way. Their expressions ranged from mild curiosity to disapproval that was barely concealed. However, this was October 1964. The Civil Rights Act had been signed just 3 months prior, in July. Most customers understood that open discrimination was no longer legally acceptable, even if they personally felt resentful about sharing shopping spaces with black patrons. Then, Charles Whitfield Patton III entered the store. The time was 3:02 p.m. Patton was 64 years old in October 1964. He worked as a real estate developer. He had inherited $12 million from his grandfather's shipping fortune. That inheritance had grown into an empire estimated at $45 million. This expansion came through aggressive acquisition of Manhattan properties. He owned 19 buildings scattered throughout Midtown Manhattan. He controlled development projects all across the city. He sat on the boards of 3 banks and 2 country clubs. These country clubs had only recently begun admitting token Jewish members under legal pressure. They still found ways to exclude black applicants through various excuses. Throughout New York's business elite, he was known as someone who had built his fortune partly by refusing to rent apartments to what he called undesirables, his term for black families, Puerto Rican families, and anyone else he considered beneath the standards of proper Manhattan society. Patton walked into Bergmann Sterling expecting to collect suits he had custom-tailored. When he noticed 2 well-dressed black women standing near the evening wear section, examining expensive dresses while a white sales clerk attended to them, his face turned deep red. The rage that overtook him was instantaneous and volcanic, according to witnesses who described what they saw. What happened next? 7 customers and 3 store employees witnessed the confrontation. They spoke with the New York Observer between October 11th and October 13th, 1964. According to them, what unfolded was a display of racist hatred so extreme, so public, and so personally vicious that even customers who themselves held racist views were shocked by Patton's behavior. This was an era when the Civil Rights Act had supposedly made such open discrimination both illegal and socially unacceptable. Patton strode directly toward May and Ruthie. His voice rose with each step he took. Soon he was shouting loudly enough that everyone in the store could hear every single word of what he said. The specific words, the racial slurs, the degrading insults, the vile characterizations that Piton hurled at two women he had never met. These are too offensive to print verbatim in a family newspaper. But witnesses described language that included multiple uses of the most hateful racial epithet. Explicit statements that black people had no business shopping in stores meant for white society. References to the Civil Rights Act as communist legislation that was destroying America. Threats to have them arrested for disturbing the peace. Accusations that they must have stolen the money they were carrying. Because black people couldn't possibly afford Bergmann and Sterling's prices through legitimate means. And personal attacks on their appearance and character that reduced both women to tears. He called them every racist name you can imagine, says Margaret Holbrook, who was 50 years old at the time. She was shopping for her granddaughter's baptism dress when the confrontation occurred. Holbrook spoke with the Observer on October 12, 1964, at her Upper East Side home. I've lived in New York my entire life, and I grew up hearing racist language. Unfortunately, it was common when I was young. But by October 1964, with everything that's happened in the civil rights movement, with the Civil Rights Act having been passed just 3 months ago, most people understand you can't talk like that anymore, especially not in public. But Charles Piton didn't care. He was screaming at those two women, calling them animals, saying they were contaminating the store by their presence, saying the Civil Rights Act was illegal and that store owners should have the right to refuse service to anyone they choose, demanding they leave immediately before he had them physically removed. The two women, the older one and the younger one, just stood there taking this abuse, not responding, not fighting back, clearly trying to maintain their dignity despite being publicly humiliated by a man who was acting like an absolute monster. Piton didn't stop with verbal abuse. According to witnesses, he grabbed a dress Ruthie had been examining, a $650 evening gown made of imported French silk. He threw it on the floor. He said it was ruined now that a black woman had touched it. He announced that he'd personally pay for the dress if the store would destroy it, rather than attempting to sell contaminated merchandise. He demanded the store manager come out and explain why these people had been allowed into the store despite their obvious unsuitability for an establishment serving Manhattan's elite. He threatened to withdraw his business from Bergmann and Sterling unless management immediately returned to its previous policy of discouraging black customers. The whole confrontation lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like an hour, says Robert Chen, who was 42 years old, a store employee who witnessed the incident. Chen spoke with the Observer on October 13, 1964. Mr. Piton was completely out of control, shouting these horrible racist things while the two black women just stood there silently enduring it. The older woman, she looked like she wanted to respond, but was deliberately holding herself back, like she knew that engaging would only make things worse. The younger woman was crying, clearly devastated by what was being said to her. Other customers were standing around, watching, and most of them looked uncomfortable. But nobody intervened. Nobody told Piton to stop. Nobody defended those two women. We all just watched while this wealthy white man destroyed two people's dignity in the middle of our store. Finally, after what witnesses estimate was 5 to 7 minutes of relentless racist abuse, Mayme Johnson took her daughter's hand. She walked toward the door with her head held high, refusing to run or show anything beyond quiet dignity, despite the tears streaming down both their faces. Piton followed them to the door, continuing to shout insults and racial slurs until they were outside on the sidewalk. The last thing I heard him say, recalls Holbrook, was, "The Civil Rights Act doesn't change reality. This isn't your neighborhood. And stores like this aren't for people like you, no matter what the communist government in Washington says." He was standing in the doorway, shouting at them as they walked away down the street. It was one of the most disturbing things I've ever witnessed, especially in 1964 when we're supposed to be past this kind of open hatred. What Charles Peton didn't know, what nobody in Bergmann and Sterling knew until approximately 72 hours later, was that he had just made the worst mistake of his life. The two women he'd publicly degraded and humiliated weren't random black shoppers he could abuse with impunity. They were the wife and daughter of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the most powerful and most dangerous criminal in Harlem, a man who'd been released from federal prison just 11 months earlier, in November 1963, who'd spent the past year rebuilding his criminal empire and reestablishing the network of connections that made him one of the most influential figures, criminal or legitimate, in New York City. And Bumpy Johnson was about to teach Charles Whitfield Peton III a lesson about respect, a lesson that would cost Peton everything he'd spent his lifetime building. Saturday evening, October 10th, 1964. Daddy, he called us animals. May and Ruthie Johnson arrived at Bumpy's office above the Palm Cafe on 125th Street at approximately 4:30 p.m. on Saturday, October 10th, 1964. Both were still visibly shaken from what had happened at Bergmann and Sterling 90 minutes earlier. According to William Bub Hewlett, Johnson's bodyguard and close associate who was present when they arrived, May tried initially to downplay the incident. She didn't want to burden her husband with problems that might draw police attention. Just 11 months after his release from federal prison, May came in trying to act like everything was fine, Hewlett told The Observer in an interview on October 13, 1964. But Ruthie was still crying, and Bumpy took one look at his daughter's face and knew something serious had happened. He asked what was wrong, and May tried to say it was nothing, just an unpleasant encounter at a store. The kind of thing black women deal with regularly, even now in 1964, despite the Civil Rights Act, but Bumpy kept pressing. And finally Ruthie told him what happened, told him about this white man at Bergmann and Sterling who'd screamed racist insults at them, who'd called them every vile name you can imagine, who'd thrown clothing on the floor and said it was contaminated, who'd humiliated them in front of a store full of white customers who'd watched without helping. According to Hewlett, Johnson listened to his daughter's account in complete silence. His face showed no emotion beyond a slight tightening around his eyes. People who knew him recognized this as a sign of carefully controlled rage. When Ruthie finished describing what Peton had said to them, Johnson asked a single question. Did anyone get this man's name? May said no. They'd been so focused on maintaining their dignity and leaving the situation that they hadn't asked for identification. But she mentioned that the store manager had called him Mr. Peton while trying unsuccessfully to calm him down, and that he'd mentioned owning buildings in Manhattan, and that he'd been picking up custom-tailored suits, which suggested he was a regular customer wealthy enough to afford bespoke clothing. Johnson nodded slowly. Then he said, according to Hewlett, "Go home and rest. Take care of Ruthie. Don't worry about this anymore. I'll handle it." The way Bumpy said, "I'll handle it," Hewlett recalls. His voice was so calm and so cold that I knew immediately someone was going to pay severely for what had happened. Bumpy was usually warm with his family, affectionate, protective, but not overbearing. But when someone hurt his family, Bumpy became a completely different person, ice cold, absolutely focused, and terrifying to anyone who understood what he was capable of when he decided someone needed to be dealt with. After May and Ruthie left, Johnson spent the next hour making phone calls to Theodore Green, his attorney, to various business associates, to contacts who had information about Manhattan real estate and business affairs. By 6 p.m., Saturday evening, Johnson had identified Charles Whitfield Peton III, had learned about his $45 million real estate empire, his racist reputation, his social connections, his business holdings, and most importantly, his vulnerabilities. The ways that someone with sufficient resources and sufficient determination could destroy everything Peton had built. Bumpy made maybe 20 phone calls Saturday evening, says Green, who spoke with The Observer on October 12, 1964. He was gathering information, asking questions about Peton's business operations, learning who Peyton's partners were, who his creditors were, what properties he owned, what debts he carried, what deals he had pending. Bumpy was doing reconnaissance, planning strategy, figuring out exactly how to hurt Peyton in ways that would be devastating. But that couldn't be traced back to Bumpy, and what Bumpy discovered was that Peyton's fortune, as large as it appeared, was actually quite vulnerable, because Peyton operated with massive leverage, had borrowed heavily to finance his development projects, and was dependent on continued bank financing to maintain his operations. By Sunday morning, October 11th, 1964, Johnson had developed a comprehensive plan for destroying Charles Peyton's business empire, his social standing, and his reputation. The plan would unfold over 72 hours and would involve Johnson's criminal organization, his legitimate business contacts, his political connections, and his understanding of how Manhattan's business elite operated in the new reality of post-Civil Rights Act America, where open racism was becoming increasingly expensive, both socially and economically. Bumpy's genius wasn't just that he was willing to hurt people who hurt his family, Green explains. His genius was that he understood exactly how to hurt them in ways that were proportionate to their offense, that were devastating to them personally. And that couldn't be easily traced back to him. Peyton had used social power and racist hatred to humiliate Bumpy's wife and daughter, so Bumpy was going to use social and economic power to destroy Peyton completely. And he was going to do it in ways that would send a message to every other racist businessman in Manhattan. The Civil Rights Act isn't just a piece of paper, and attacking black people, especially black people connected to someone like Bumpy Johnson, carries consequences that will destroy you. Sunday morning, Johnson began making calls to various business associates and political contacts, explaining what had happened to his family, and asking for assistance with a matter that required discretion and coordination. According to multiple sources, Johnson spent approximately $75,000 over the next 72 hours, not on bribes or illegal activities, but on legitimate business transactions and strategic interventions that were perfectly legal, but that were deployed with surgical precision to damage Peyton's business interests. The bank connections. Johnson had relationships with 3 banks that did business in Harlem and that also held substantial loans for Peyton's development projects. Through intermediaries, Johnson arranged for these banks to receive detailed information that was factually accurate, but that had been strategically compiled to make Peyton's financial position appear more precarious than it actually was. Bumpy had his people create financial analyses of Peyton's holdings, says Green. The analyses were completely accurate. They didn't contain any false information, but they emphasized the risks in Peyton's highly leveraged positions, highlighted how dependent he was on continued financing, noted that several of his development projects were behind schedule and over budget, and most importantly, pointed out that Peyton's public racist behavior on October 10th at Bergmann Sterling violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the Civil Rights Act, and could expose any bank doing business with him to negative publicity and potential legal complications. These analyses were delivered to loan officers at the 3 banks on Sunday afternoon, along with suggestions that the banks might want to review their exposure to Peyton's operations given the risks identified. By Monday morning, October 12th, all 3 banks had initiated reviews of Peyton's loans, not because they'd been ordered to do so, but because the information Johnson provided had made loan officers nervous about their institution's exposure to a developer who appeared to be overextended, and who demonstrated the kind of public racism that was increasingly toxic in October 1964. The Civil Rights Organization outreach. Johnson had relationships with several civil rights organizations operating in New York, organizations he'd supported financially despite his criminal background, because he believed in their goals, and because supporting civil rights causes provided him with political cover and social legitimacy. Through contacts in these organizations, Johnson arranged for Peyton to become a target of civil rights activism, not through violence or illegal harassment, But through completely legal protests, boycotts, and public attention, Bumpy contacted representatives from CORE, from the NAACP, from local civil rights groups, says Reverend James Mitchell, 71 years old, a Harlem minister who worked closely with civil rights organizations and who spoke with the Observer on October 13th, 1964. Bumpy provided detailed information about Pétain's racist business practices, his refusal to rent to black families, his history of discrimination, the public incident at Bergmann Sterling, and Bumpy offered to fund organizing efforts targeting Pétain's properties and businesses. The civil rights organizations were initially skeptical about accepting money from a criminal, but Bumpy made clear he wasn't asking for control or credit. He just wanted to support legitimate activism against a racist businessman who deserved to face consequences. The organizations accepted the funding and began planning protests and boycotts. The business partner pressure. Pétain had several business partners in various development projects, wealthy men who'd invested money with Pétain, expecting substantial returns. Through his network, Johnson arranged for these partners to receive information suggesting that Pétain's public racism was about to become a major liability, that civil rights organizations were planning to target Pétain's properties, and that partners might want to reconsider their investments before the negative attention affected their own reputations. The information wasn't threats and wasn't false, Green explains. It was accurate reporting about what civil rights organizations were actually planning to do. Protests, boycotts, negative media attention, combined with suggestions that remaining partnered with Pétain while he was being targeted for racism might not be good for the partners' own businesses. The partners received these warnings from sources they considered credible, and they started asking Pétain questions about his civil rights problems, his ability to manage negative publicity, his plans for addressing the criticism he was about to face. Pétain had to spend Sunday and Monday reassuring nervous partners that everything was fine, which distracted him from actually managing his business, and which created the appearance of crisis even though the protests hadn't even started yet. The media campaign. Johnson had relationships with several black newspapers and with white journalists who covered Harlem and civil rights issues in New York. Through these contacts, Johnson arranged for stories to be written about the Bergmann Sterling incident, about Pétain's history of racist business practices, about how the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was being violated by Manhattan businessmen who continued to practice discrimination openly. The stories began appearing in black newspapers on Sunday, October 11th, and in white newspapers on Monday, October 12th. The New York Amsterdam News ran a front-page story titled "Manhattan Developer Screams Racist Abuse at Black Shoppers, Throws Clothing on Floor." The New York Times ran a smaller story on page 12 of the Monday edition titled "Allegations of Discrimination at Fifth Avenue Boutique Following Confrontation." The stories didn't initially identify May and Ruthie by name. Johnson was protecting his family's privacy, but they provided enough detail about the incident that anyone who'd been at Bergmann Sterling on October 10th would recognize what was being described. Monday morning brought additional strategic moves designed to destabilize Pétain's business operations and social standing simultaneously. The civil rights protests begin. At 9 a.m. on Monday, October 12th, approximately 50 protesters organized by CORE and the NAACP gathered outside Pétain's largest residential building on West 86th Street. They carried signs that read, "Pétain discriminates against black tenants, racist landlord violates Civil Rights Act, and justice for all, no exceptions." The protesters distributed flyers describing Pétain's October 10th behavior at Bergmann Sterling and documenting his history of refusing to rent to black families. Similar protests occurred at two other Pétain properties on Monday, with protesters maintaining peaceful demonstrations that attracted media attention, and that created the appearance of major controversy surrounding Pétain's business practices. The protests were completely legal and completely effective, says Reverend Mitchell. The protesters didn't block entrances. Didn't threaten anyone, just stood on public sidewalks holding signs and distributing information. But the effect was powerful. Suddenly, Peton's properties were associated with racism and civil rights violations in ways that made them less desirable to potential tenants. And that made Peton's partners nervous about being connected to someone who was being targeted by civil rights organizations. The tenant organization. Johnson funded organizers who helped coordinate tenants living in Peton's buildings. Tenants who'd been tolerating substandard maintenance, excessive rent increases, and discriminatory practices because they had limited alternative housing options. On Monday evening, October 12th, approximately 200 tenants from 9 of Peton's buildings met at a Harlem church and formed a tenant organization that announced it would begin collective action. Rent strikes, complaints to city housing authorities, legal challenges to discriminatory practices. Unless Peton immediately improved conditions and stopped discrimination, Bumpy provided money to print flyers, to hire a lawyer to advise the tenants about their rights under the new Civil Rights Act, to rent the church space for the organizing meeting, says Reverend Mitchell. But Bumpy didn't want credit or public recognition. He just wanted Peton to face consequences for how he treated black people, not just for what he'd done to Bumpy's family, but for years of discrimination against black tenants who'd been powerless to fight back individually. But who could fight back collectively if someone gave them resources and organization? The country club problem? Peton belonged to 2 exclusive Manhattan country clubs that had historically excluded black and Jewish members. But that had recently admitted token Jewish members under legal and social pressure following passage of the Civil Rights Act. Through intermediaries, Johnson arranged for both clubs to receive detailed documentation about Peton's October 10th behavior at Bergmann Sterling, about the civil rights protests targeting his properties, about the tenant organizing, and about the media attention focusing on Peton's racism. The country clubs were in extremely delicate positions in October 1964, Green explains. The Civil Rights Act had passed 3 months earlier. Clubs were facing pressure to integrate. They were trying to navigate between their members who wanted to maintain exclusivity and the new legal reality that made discrimination increasingly difficult to defend. What Peton had done, screaming racist abuse at black women in public, was exactly the kind of behavior that made clubs vulnerable to criticism and legal challenges. The clubs received this information along with suggestions that keeping Peton as a member while he was being targeted by civil rights organizations might attract unwanted attention to the club's own discriminatory practices. By Monday evening, one country club had asked Peton to resign his membership to allow the club to avoid becoming involved in controversies unrelated to club activities. The second club placed Peton's membership under review pending investigation of the allegations against him. By Tuesday morning, October 13th, the cumulative pressure from multiple simultaneous fronts had created a genuine crisis for Peton's business operations. Bank loan calls. 2 of the 3 banks that had reviewed their exposure to Peton's projects decided to call their loans, demanding immediate repayment of $9 million total. Based on clauses in the loan agreements that allowed banks to demand repayment if they determined the borrower's financial condition had deteriorated significantly, or if the borrower's public behavior created reputational risks for the lending institution. The loans were technically callable, Green explains. The loan agreements had provisions allowing banks to demand repayment if they judged the borrower's situation had changed in ways that increased risk. Bumpy's information campaign had convinced the banks that Peton's highly leveraged position, combined with the civil rights protests and media attention, created unacceptable risks, so they exercised their legal right to call the loans. Peton didn't have $9 million in liquid assets to repay the loans immediately, which meant he'd have to sell properties quickly at disadvantageous prices, or find alternative financing at higher interest rates during a period when his name was associated with racism and civil rights violations. Partner withdrawals. 4 of Peton's business partners announced on Tuesday that they were withdrawing from joint development projects. citing concerns about Piton's management of civil rights issues and about negative publicity that might affect project viability. The partner withdrawals required Piton to buy out their stakes in the projects, further draining his cash reserves, or to find replacement partners willing to invest in projects that were suddenly surrounded by protests and controversy. Tenant strike. The tenant organization announced on Tuesday evening that it was beginning a rent strike in 4 of Piton's buildings, with approximately 150 families depositing their rent payments into escrow accounts rather than paying Piton directly, until building conditions improved and discriminatory practices ended. The rent strike affected approximately $60,000 in monthly revenue and created legal complications that required Piton to hire attorneys to fight eviction cases that he'd normally win easily. But that became difficult when tenants had organized legal representation and media support. Social ostracism begins. Several prominent Manhattan families who'd previously socialized with Piton began quietly distancing themselves on Tuesday, declining dinner invitations, removing him from guest lists for social events, making clear through subtle but unmistakable signals that Piton's public display of racism in October 1964, 3 months after passage of the Civil Rights Act, had made him socially unacceptable in circles that were attempting to adapt to the new legal and social reality, even if they personally retained racist views. The social isolation was swift and decisive, says Margaret Holbrook, who'd witnessed the Bergmann and Sterling incident and who moved in the same social circles as Piton. By Tuesday, everyone in our social circle knew what Charles had done on Saturday. Some people were genuinely offended by his behavior. Others weren't particularly bothered by the racism itself, but were bothered by how public and crude it had been. Screaming in a store, throwing clothing on the floor, creating a scene that got reported in newspapers. In October 1964, you simply can't behave that way anymore without consequences. The Civil Rights Act has changed things. Social attitudes are changing. Charles's behavior on October 10th would have been more tolerated in 1954, but in 1964, it's unacceptable. By Tuesday evening, Charles was being systematically excluded from social events. People who'd been his friends for decades were suddenly too busy to see him. Wednesday, October 14th, 1964. Who did this to me? By Wednesday morning, October 14th, Charles Piton's business empire was in genuine crisis. Banks were demanding $9 million in immediate loan repayments. Partners were withdrawing from projects. Tenants were striking. Civil rights protesters were demonstrating at his properties daily. Newspapers were running stories about his racist business practices. One country club had expelled him and another had suspended his membership. His social circle had abandoned him, and he still had no clear understanding of why everything had collapsed simultaneously. According to sources close to Piton, he spent Wednesday morning making frantic phone calls, trying to determine what had happened, why banks had suddenly called his loans, why partners had lost confidence, why civil rights organizations had targeted him specifically when hundreds of Manhattan landlords practiced similar discrimination. Several people he called mentioned the October 10th incident at Bergmann and Sterling, the protests that had begun Monday, the media attention he was receiving, the concern that anyone associated with Piton might be tainted by association with someone who'd become a symbol of racism in post-Civil Rights Act America. But nobody mentioned Bumpy Johnson, because Johnson's involvement had been so carefully hidden, because every action taken against Piton had been technically legal and had been executed through intermediaries who couldn't be connected back to Johnson. Piton had no idea that his crisis had been orchestrated by anyone specifically, much less by the husband of 2 women he'd abused at Bergmann and Sterling 4 days earlier, until Wednesday afternoon, when Piton received a visit at his Midtown Manhattan office from Theodore Green, who introduced himself as an attorney representing certain Harlem business interests. I walked into Piton's office at about 2:30 p.m. on Wednesday, October 14th, Green told the Observer. Piton looked terrible, hadn't shaved, was wearing the same suit he'd apparently been wearing for 2 days. Looked like he hadn't slept. He was surrounded by financial documents, on the phone constantly, trying to find emergency financing to cover the loan calls. When I introduced myself, he barely looked up. He said, "Whatever you're selling, I'm not interested. I'm dealing with multiple crises." And I said, "I know. I'm here to explain why you're dealing with multiple crises simultaneously." Green then explained to Patton that the simultaneous collapse of his business and social standing wasn't coincidental. It was orchestrated retaliation for what Patton had done to May and Ruthie Johnson at Bergmann Sterling on Saturday, October 10th, 1964. I told him, "Last Saturday, you publicly humiliated 2 black women at a Fifth Avenue boutique. You screamed racist abuse at them for several minutes. You threw expensive clothing on the floor. You said the Civil Rights Act was communist legislation. You demanded they leave the store." Those 2 women were the wife and daughter of Ellsworth Johnson, who controls substantial business interests in Harlem and who has extensive connections throughout New York's business, political, and civil rights communities. Mr. Johnson was displeased by how you treated his family. What's happened to you over the past 4 days? The bank loan calls, the partner withdrawals, the civil rights protests, the tenant organizing, the media attention, the social ostracism? That was Mr. Johnson teaching you a lesson about respect. And about the fact that the Civil Rights Act isn't just a piece of paper. There are consequences for treating black people the way you treated Mr. Johnson's wife and daughter. According to Green, Patton's face went white as he understood what was being explained to him. He said, "That's impossible. Bumpy Johnson is a criminal. He just got out of federal prison last year. He has no power over banks and country clubs and business partners and civil rights organizations." And I said, "Mr. Johnson has relationships throughout this city that you apparently never suspected existed. He has contacts in every community, black, white, Chinese, Italian, Jewish, Puerto Rican. He has influence that extends far beyond the criminal underworld. He supports civil rights organizations financially. He has connections to politicians, to media, to business leaders. And when someone hurts his family, Mr. Johnson uses every resource available to him to ensure that person regrets their actions." Welcome to October 1964, Mr. Patton. The Civil Rights Act means something now, and people like Mr. Johnson are going to make sure it means something by ensuring that racists like you pay prices for discrimination that you thought you could practice with impunity. Patton asked what he could do to make the situation stop, how he could convince Johnson to call off the pressure that was destroying his business. Green's response was simple: "Nothing. The damage is done. Your loans are called. Your partners have withdrawn. Your tenants are organized. Civil rights groups are protesting your properties. Your social standing is destroyed. Mr. Johnson isn't interested in your apologies or your money. He's already accomplished what he set out to accomplish, teaching you that there are devastating consequences for treating black people with the kind of racist contempt you displayed on October 10th. Consider this an expensive lesson about what the Civil Rights Act actually means in practice, Mr. Patton. It means that black people have allies now, people like Mr. Johnson who have the resources and intelligence to fight back when you attack us. And consider yourself fortunate that Mr. Johnson chose to hurt your business rather than hurting you personally." Green stood up to leave, then delivered Johnson's final message. "Oh, and Mr. Patton, Mr. Johnson wants you to know that his wife and daughter are going to return to Bergmann Sterling next Saturday, October 17th. They're going to shop there again. And if anyone, you, the store management, any other customers, treats them with anything less than complete respect, what's happened to you this week will seem minor compared to what happens next. Do you understand?" Patton reportedly just nodded, too shocked and too devastated to respond verbally. On Saturday, October 17th, 1964, Exactly 1 week after the original incident, May and Ruthie Johnson returned to Bergmann Sterling at 2:45 p.m. They were accompanied by Theodore Green and by William Hewlett, who positioned themselves near the entrance, but didn't enter the store with the women. Also present outside the store were approximately 30 members of CORE and the NAACP who'd come to observe the visit and to ensure that no harassment occurred. According to witnesses, the return visit proceeded very differently from the first visit. The store manager greeted May and Ruthie personally at the door, apologizing profusely for what had happened on October 10th, explaining that Mr. Piton was no longer welcome at Bergmann Sterling and had been permanently banned from the premises, assuring them that all black customers would be welcomed and served with complete courtesy going forward. In full compliance with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 3 sales clerks attended to May and Ruthie throughout their 90-minute shopping visit, showing them the finest selections, offering detailed service, treating them with the elaborate courtesy normally reserved for the store's wealthiest customers, regardless of race. Other customers in the store, including several who had been present on October 10th and had watched Piton's racist tirade without intervening, went out of their way to be friendly, making polite conversation, complimenting May and Ruthie's clothing and taste, making clear through their behavior that black customers were welcome and that what had happened the previous week would not be tolerated again. The difference was extraordinary, says Margaret Holbrook, who was again shopping at Bergmann Sterling that Saturday and who witnessed the return visit. Last week, those 2 women were subjected to horrific racist abuse while we all stood by and did nothing to our shame. This week, they were treated like royalty. The store manager was apologetic and attentive. The sales clerks were professional and courteous, and those of us who'd been there last week made sure to show through our behavior that we didn't approve of what Piton had done and that we understood things need to be different now in October 1964. I personally introduced myself to the older woman, Mrs. Johnson, I learned her name was, and apologized for not defending them on October 10th when they were being abused. She was very gracious, said she appreciated the apology, said she hoped that what had happened would lead to changes that would benefit all black shoppers who'd been excluded from or mistreated at stores like this for too long. May and Ruthie purchased approximately $1,500 worth of clothing and accessories during their visit. The evening wear they'd originally come to shop for, plus additional items. The store manager personally wrapped their purchases and walked them to the door, again apologizing for the October 10th incident, and inviting them to return any time. Outside the store, the CORE and NAACP members who'd been observing applauded as May and Ruthie exited carrying their shopping bags, a gesture of solidarity and celebration. That black women could now shop at exclusive Fifth Avenue boutiques without fear of racist harassment, that the Civil Rights Act was being enforced, not just by law, but by community action and strategic pressure. As May and Ruthie left Bergmann Sterling, Hewlett and Green fell into step beside them for the walk back to the car that was waiting to drive them back to Harlem. "How was your shopping experience, Mrs. Johnson?" Green asked, smiling slightly. "Much improved from last Saturday." "Thank you, Theodore," May responded, according to Hewlett's later account to the Observer. "Please tell Bumpy that his intervention was appreciated and extremely effective. Though I suspect the entire city knows by now what happens when someone insults his family. I'll pass along the message," Green said, "though I suspect he already knows. And I suspect every other racist businessman in Manhattan knows too." Charles Whitfield Piton III never recovered from the 72-hour systematic destruction of his business empire and social standing. By December 1964, he'd been forced to sell 14 of his 19 buildings at substantial losses, to raise cash to cover the loan calls, and to buy out his partner's stakes in various projects. His net worth declined from an estimated $45 million in October 1964 to approximately $11 million by February 1965, a loss of $34 million in 4 months. The social ostracism continued indefinitely. Peton was permanently expelled from both country clubs. Manhattan's social elite continued to exclude him from gatherings and events. His wife filed for separation in January 1965, moving to their Connecticut estate and refusing to return to New York, citing her inability to show her face in Manhattan society after her husband had become synonymous with racist hatred in the new civil rights era. Peton attempted to rebuild his business reputation in 1965 and 1966, but found that his name had become toxic. Banks were reluctant to lend to him. Partners were unwilling to invest with him. Tenants actively avoided his properties when alternatives were available. He died of a heart attack in April 1968 at age 68, essentially forgotten by the society that had once embraced him as a pillar of Manhattan's business establishment. What Bumpy did to Peton became legendary in both the criminal world and in the civil rights movement, says Reverend Mitchell. Criminals saw it as proof that Bumpy Johnson's power extended far beyond Harlem, that he could destroy anyone who crossed him. Regardless of how wealthy or well-connected they were, civil rights activists saw it as a perfect example of how the Civil Rights Act could be enforced through strategic economic pressure and community organizing. How racist businessmen who thought they could continue discriminating could be bankrupted and humiliated when they offended the wrong people. Peton learned too late that October 1964 is different from October 1954. That the Civil Rights Act has teeth when people like Bumpy Johnson decide to use it as a weapon against racism. That treating black people with racist contempt carries consequences that can destroy everything you've spent your life building. The destruction of Charles Peyton, combined with the organizing efforts Johnson had funded and the media attention the incident had generated, created ripple effects throughout Manhattan's retail and real estate industries. In late 1964 and throughout 1965, several exclusive stores that had been slow to implement the Civil Rights Act's requirements, maintaining informal policies that discouraged black customers through hostile treatment, even if they no longer explicitly refused service, began actively welcoming black shoppers and training staff in non-discriminatory service. Bergmann Sterling became a symbol of how quickly integration could happen when economic incentives aligned with legal requirements. The store hired its first black sales clerk in November 1964 and began advertising in black newspapers that all customers would be served with equal courtesy. Other Fifth Avenue stores followed gradually through 1965, partly due to fear of similar retaliation from powerful figures they might unknowingly offend, partly due to civil rights pressure that Johnson's organizing had helped catalyze, and partly due to recognition that excluding wealthy black customers in October 1964 was both legally risky and economically foolish. Bumpy didn't set out to integrate Manhattan stores, says Green. He set out to hurt the man who'd hurt his family. But by destroying Peton so publicly and so completely, by demonstrating that racist business practices could carry devastating economic consequences in the post-Civil Rights Act era, Bumpy inadvertently accelerated the integration of Manhattan's retail and real estate industries. Stores integrated faster in late 1964 and 1965, partly because the Civil Rights Act required it, but also partly because businessmen who'd seen what happened to Peton understood that racism could be expensive when it offended people who had the resources and determination to fight back. The Peton case became a cautionary tale that spread through Manhattan's business elite. Don't discriminate publicly. Don't abuse black customers, because you never know who they're connected to, and you never know what consequences you might face. Bumpy Johnson never publicly acknowledged his role in destroying Charles Peton's fortune. When contacted by the Observer requesting comment for this story, Johnson declined through his attorney Theodore Green, who issued a written statement on October 13, 1964. Mr. Johnson has no knowledge of Mr. Peton's business difficulties or social problems. Mr. Johnson is a Harlem businessman who focuses on his own affairs. and who has no involvement in Manhattan real estate or in the personal conflicts of individuals he's never met. If Mr. Piton is experiencing financial difficulties, Mr. Johnson suggests he consult with his bankers and business advisors rather than looking for external scapegoats for his problems. Mr. Johnson supports the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and believes that all Americans should be treated with equal dignity and respect, regardless of race. Any businessman who violates the Civil Rights Act should expect to face appropriate legal and economic consequences. But among Johnson's associates, friends, and family, there was no ambiguity about what had happened or why. Bumpy never talked about what he did to Piton, says Hewlett. He didn't brag about it, didn't seek credit for it, didn't want publicity that would draw law enforcement attention or that would make it too obvious that he'd orchestrated the whole thing. But everyone close to Bumpy knew what happened. Piton insulted Bumpy's wife and daughter on October 10th. Within 72 hours, Piton's entire world collapsed. The connection was obvious to anyone paying attention, and the message was equally obvious. Don't hurt Bumpy Johnson's family unless you're prepared to lose everything you value. The Civil Rights Act is real now in October 1964. And people like Bumpy are going to make sure it's enforced by making examples of racists who think they can keep discriminating the way they did before July 1964. The story of what happened after October 10th, 1964, spread through Harlem and through New York's criminal underworld and through the civil rights movement. As an example of how power can be deployed effectively to enforce civil rights when legal remedies alone are insufficient to change behavior. A wealthy, white racist humiliated two black women in a Fifth Avenue store on October 10th, 1964, not knowing they were connected to someone with the resources to fight back in the new reality of post-Civil Rights Act America. Within 1 week, that racist had lost $34 million. His social standing, his business partnerships, and his place in Manhattan society, and two black women returned to the store that had witnessed their humiliation, where they were welcomed and served with respect, where they shopped for expensive clothing, surrounded by white customers who treated them as equals, where the manager personally apologized and promised that what had happened would never happen again. That was the lesson Charles Piton learned too late. That October 1964 is different from October 1954, that the Civil Rights Act has changed the rules, and that Bumpy Johnson, despite being a criminal, despite having just been released from federal prison 11 months earlier in November 1963, had more real power to enforce civil rights than most of Manhattan's wealthy white elite could imagine. The insult that Piton thought he could deliver with impunity cost him everything he'd spent his lifetime building, and it changed who could shop where in New York City in the months after the Civil Rights Act was signed. Opened doors that had been closed, challenged assumptions that had seemed permanent, and demonstrated that the new law had teeth when people with sufficient intelligence and resources decided to enforce it through strategic economic warfare. All because Bumpy Johnson understood something that Charles Piton never learned. That real power in October 1964 isn't about who you can hurt without consequences. It's about making sure that people who violate civil rights and hurt what you value pay prices they can't afford.